So we are in John 15, and I want to start off by talking about a moment that's really curious to me. It's really confusing. For a long time, it confounded me. It didn't make a whole lot of sense to me, and maybe it will confuse and confound you. It was a time when Jesus got real mad. So this is a moment where we're talking about a time when Jesus got real mad, and it always confused me. I don't know about you, but like the idea of Jesus getting mad, it kind of violates my idea of who Jesus is, right? So Jesus is the Prince of Peace after all. So what's going on with the madness, right? So here's the story. It's in Matthew 21. Let me just read. It says, early in the morning, as Jesus was on his way back to the city. Let me set the scene. This is the last week of Jesus' life. We celebrate something on the church calendar called Palm Sunday, which is the day when Jesus enters into the city of Jerusalem. He'd be there, and he'd be there for a while as Passover. Hundreds and hundreds and thousands of pilgrims that come to Jerusalem to celebrate the Passover meal. And Jesus is there with all these folks who are coming from all over. And that week would be the week he would be arrested, he'd be tortured, he'd be beaten, he'd be killed. And that would be his final week on earth. And so he is in Jerusalem. It says early in the morning, as Jesus was on his way back to the city, he was hungry. I love this. I love this detail. I too am hungry sometimes. And so I feel like Jesus sees me. Seeing a fig tree by the road, he went up to it, but found nothing on it except leaves. Then he said to the fig tree, he said to it, "May you never bear fruit again," and immediately the tree withered. So this is a scene where Jesus kills a tree. And it's weird, right? It's like, Jesus, like it's a little like, who peed in your Cheerios? Like, what is going, why are you so mad about this thing? And so this is a fig tree in the ancient, and this is actually, let me show you a picture of a fig tree. This is actually in the Holy Land. This is the oldest tree in the Holy Land. This is more than 1,200 years old, they think. Which wouldn't have put it at the time of Jesus, but they really think that actually in this area, this is probably one of the children of the fig tree that Jesus was near, or one of the trees that Jesus would have walked near. So they live forever. They're huge, and they produce this fruit called figs. Let me show you. There's some here, and those are dried figs. Anybody here have a fig tree in your yard? Have a fig tree in your like, anyone see? I've got dear friends, they've got a fig tree in their backyard, and we'll eat outside, and it will drop its fruit. It's heavy fruit. It'll like throw it at us. I think it smells like, you're Christians and you killed my grandfather, and it's just throwing fruit. That's not theologically accurate in any way. Everything I said was wrong, but it's interesting. I didn't know about figs growing up. We did not have fig trees in Ohio. The only fig that I had was in Newton form. That's all I knew about. So let me tell you a little bit. So this is a little strange, right? Jesus comes up to a tree during a non-fruit-bearing season, finds no fruit on the tree during fruit-bearing season, and then curses it and the tree dies. Like, what is going on here? So a little bit of background on fig trees. Interesting. Fig trees are really interesting because figs are really big fruit. And what happens is fig trees actually grow these buds that are precursor fruit. It's one of the rare fruit trees that has a precursor fruit. These precursor fruit they're edible, and they're actually called tuckwashes, Taqsh's. They appear with the leaves, but they actually appear long before that tuckwash actually turns into an actual fig, an actual full fig, an actual full fruit. So here's the thing. If a tree has leaves, and you look at the branches right before, during the season when it's growing, you're going to see a lot of tuckwashes. And what would happen is the people who were in poverty back in the ancient world would come by and they would eat those. They're edible and they're filled with calories and they're filled with nutrients. But if you look at a tree and it's got no tuckwash and it's got leaves, what does that mean later on in the fruit season? It will have no fruit. There's no hope for fruit. And Jesus gets really upset at this. And he curses it. But so what's going on here? So that's what's going on. This is a commentary on fruitfulness. But remember, I want to talk about this for a second, that anger is always a secondary emotion. Anger is always a secondary emotion. And there's always something underneath the anger. And for most of the time, for most of human experience, for you and I, when we get angry, what's underneath it is often selfishness. We didn't get what we wanted. Somebody said something that hurt us. Our feelings are hurt. We didn't get what we wanted. Most of the time, most of our anger is pretty selfish. But not all of our anger. Sometimes when we get upset, sometimes when we get angry, it's a good thing. It's actually righteous. And you know this, like if somebody is hurting somebody that you love, you get upset. You'd be a fool not to. That's what love demands, right? Or you see an injustice in the world, something that's really wrong that should not be, and you get upset, you get angry. This is righteous anger. We don't often have righteous anger, but when we do, it's this thing. With Jesus, his anger is always good. It's always righteous. And Jesus doesn't often show anger. Remember, letting anger out into the world can be a highly destructive thing. In fact, it might be one of the most destructive things that you and I can do. But when God does it, it's usually instructive and it's for our good. It's never selfish. And what's interesting is Jesus comes up, kills a tree, and then immediately after, in all the gospel accounts, there's another story that's always tied to it. In Matthew 21, I'm going to show you what happens. Right after that moment where Jesus kills the tree, he goes into the temple. It's Passover. Thousands of people are there, and he sees something happens that makes his blood boil again. And that is, the temple is filled with money changers. All these pilgrims have come from all over the globe, and what they have to do is they have to make a Passover offering. And so Jesus enters into the temple and sees all these tables, and they're all there, and they're out there, and he sees what the money changers are doing is they're taking people who have different currency, and they're exchanging it for temple currency so you can buy an animal. But the problem is their exchange rates are taking advantage of people. It's kind of like when you go to an airport in a foreign land and they have the money exchange. It's always the worst rate, right? This was more predatory than that. This is people taking advantage of people who had traveled long distances to get their temple money, and they were exchanging it at unfair rates. This is predatory. These are people who are there for a religious experience to connect with the living God. They need an offering, and the only way to buy it, they have to get taken advantage of by these corrupt money changers. So Jesus does something shocking. He goes and he turns over all the tables, and he stands in the middle of the temple, and he's just overthrown everything. And he, with judgment and with righteous anger, is upset at this. And this is what it says in Matthew 21, right after the fig tree killing incident. Jesus entered the temple courts and drove out all who were buying and selling there. He overturned the tables of the money changers and the benches of those selling doves. It is written, he said to them, that my house will be called a house of prayer. He's quoting from an Old Testament prophet about the temple. But you are making it a den of thieves, a den of robbers. And Jesus drives them out. This is Jesus getting very angry. Now, I love that little detail about the benches of those selling doves. If you couldn't afford a lamb, if you were poor, especially very poor, they had another way. God had provided another way for you to make a sacrifice is with birds, with doves. And so if you only had a few pennies, you could buy a dove. And what happens is that even those people are being taken advantage of. Now, it's interesting. When Jesus was born, his parents, Mary and Joseph, his earthly parents, went to the temple, and they made a sacrifice. And do you know what they sacrificed? They sacrificed doves. Why? Because they were super poor. And so Jesus knew about incredible poverty. He knew people who were, his own parents were in incredible poverty. And so for someone to take advantage of people like his parents, who were in incredible poverty, do you see God's heart for this? This is astonishing. And so Jesus overturns the temple tables. These stories are related. Do you see that they're related? Jesus is utterly frustrated and angry about the dereliction of duty and the corruption from the spiritual shepherds of Israel, people who should have known better. And what Jesus is saying, and what he wants from his spiritual leaders, what he wants from all of us, is a life full of fruit. He wants fruitfulness. He wants fruitfulness. And the story of the fig tree and the story of the Israel shepherds are identical. There's no fruit. And so what's the point of this? What do you do with a fruit tree that never bears fruit? Now, you and I have a different view on trees and ecology. For example, we look at trees and we're like, great. Any tree that's out there that's green and healthy, we're like, this is fantastic, right? We think carbon footprint. We think deforestation. Let's reverse this. Let's have more oxygen in the air, right? This is good. The ancient people did not think of deforestation or carbon footprint. When there was a tree and it was a fruit tree, what's it supposed to do? produce fruit. There was not Safeways. This was their food product, right? So what do you do with a fruit tree that has no fruit? What do you do with a grapevine that has no grapes? It is literally useless. It's literally useless. And then we come to today's scripture that Archie read. John 15, Jesus is talking about this. He says, I am the vine. I am the vine. You are the branches. If you remain in me, and I in you, you will bear much fruit. But apart from me, you can do nothing. If you do not remain in me, you're like a branch that's thrown away and withers. Such branches are picked up, thrown in the fire, and burned. This is what Jesus says. Now, I want to talk about this for a second because we have to get into this. There's a thing I say it quite a bit, and I think it's true. That's why I say it. I say this line, that everyone's better with Jesus. Everyone is better with Jesus. Everybody's better with Jesus. All right, I'm better with you, you're better with Jesus. But as I think about this line, I realize this is not something that Jesus would say. I mean, I think it's true. I mean, everyone is better with Jesus. But it kind of makes it sound like Jesus is like salt, and he makes our meal just a little bit more tasty. Jesus is saying something very different. He says, without me, you're as good as dead. And that's really convicting. This is powerful. So, we have to get into this. Now, if you noticed, there was a metaphor in here about fire and burning, and if you're anything like me, you're probably on edge right now because burning metaphors scare me. I don't know about you, but sometimes I've been at churches where there's a lot of talk about hell and hellfire, and they use fear tactics, and it's kind of like Elmo and the fire, that kind of mean that, that's just like, this is not. And for some Christians, maybe you're like me, any talk of fire in the Bible immediately evokes a fear of hellfire. And to be sure, there are plenty of passages in the Old and New Testament that speak to the reality of life and eternity apart from life with God. And fire is a common metaphor in the Old and the New Testament for God's divine judgment. That is not the context of this verse, thankfully, so I don't have to talk about hell. That's awesome. There will be other times when that's another sermon for another time. We can talk about that. We can have some long conversations about that, but that's not for today. The context of this verse, the context of what Jesus is talking about, is to his followers. It's about faithfulness. Remember, who is Jesus delivering this to? He's delivering this to his followers. And he wants his followers to be fruitful. I think about the difference between Peter and Judas, right? Fruitful. Jesus wants us to be faithful and fruitful. So the context here of this verse is fruitfulness and faithfulness. We have to bear in mind that the primary concern of this text, the primary concern of Jesus, is living lives that bear fruit, lives of meaning and purpose and deep connection to the living God and kingdom fruit. And remember, before the branch is thrown into a fire, it withers. The purpose of the branch is to bear fruit. And any branch that doesn't bear fruit, biologically, we know this, it withers and dies. Any branch on a vine that does not bear fruit, it's going to wither, it's going to die. And fruitfulness, this is just a natural extension of fruitfulness or non-fruitfulness. Fruitfulness is the nature of the branch, and a fruitless branch is a dying branch. Jesus is saying to you and I, there's only really two options. There's only two options. We have only got two options. And look what Jesus says in this passage. He says, I am the vine, you are the branches. If you remain in me and I in you, you'll bear much fruit. But apart from me, you'll still bear fruit, but less. Oh no, oh look, that's not what it says at all. That's how I would say it, but it's not what Jesus says. I would say it because I don't want anyone to be like upset or feel bad. No, Jesus says, apart from me, you can do nothing. If you don't remain in me, you're like that branch. It's thrown away and withers. It's not going to produce fruit. Such branches, what happens when they're picked up and they're burned? We have to focus on this, and we have to reckon with Jesus' clear instructions and invitation and teaching. Jesus is not threatening us. He's just saying what is. This is a warning. It's not a threat. He's just pointing out the reality. We have two options: be with Jesus and bear a ton of fruit, and then this incredible difference. Not don't be in me and bear a little less fruit. That's not the option. The other option is wither, die, and burn. It'd be useless. So I think it would be, I don't want to preach through this. This is tough. So I have to pastorally and personally examine, what does it mean to have what destroys fruitfulness in my life and in yours? Because I don't want this. I don't want branches of my life to be fruitless, to not have any fruit. And if there are, I'd like very much to remove them. I think about that parable that Jesus shared. It's one of his more famous parables. He says there's 4 different types of soil, and there's a farmer in this parable who sows seed, and it falls on 4 different types of soil. And Jesus is trying to get us in that parable to examine our hearts and say, what kind of soil is my heart? Is there any part of my heart that has this kind of soil in it, any area of my life? And so, drawing from that parable and Jesus' instructions, I started thinking, what are some things that have destroyed fruitfulness in my life, or that I've seen destroy in other people's lives? But more importantly, is there any of this going on in my life? So as I go through these examples that Jesus kind of shares, they're kind of examples from that parable, maybe do some examination, see if there's any way within you that is similar to this, because I think Jesus is inviting us to full fruitfulness and to cut out and remove anything that would destroy fruitfulness. So reason number one thing that destroys fruitfulness is to refuse to listen to Jesus at all. Just flat out ignore him and live our lives as though he doesn't even exist. I have a buddy who said for years, he said I was a Christian atheist. I said, that doesn't make sense. That's an oxymoron. He said, you're an oxymoron. I said, I didn't call you names. Anyway, it was a long back and forth. So I said, what do you mean by Christian atheist? He said, well, I said I believed in God, but if you looked at my life under scrutiny, it was pretty clear I didn't really care about Jesus. I believed in God, but honestly, I didn't even know him. I didn't take time to read the Bible. I didn't even know what the Bible said. I just kind of made God my own image. I said I believed in God, but I trusted in money and my career a lot more than God. I said I believed in God, but honestly, I pursued my own happiness more than kingdom fruit. And I said I believed in God, but honestly, I didn't care about the things God cares about. I cared about what I cared about. And most of my prayers were, God, would you help me with my stuff today? He said, for years, I actually didn't really try to listen to Jesus at all. I just tried to get his attention for my stuff. That destroys fruitfulness. And I was convicted by that. I said, there's times when I live like a Christian atheist too. And I'm a pastor, and it should not be so. And maybe there's ways that I've let that sneak in. And God, if there's any wayward way within me, would you help me see areas I'm not even listening to you at all? Another way is to render Jesus lip service, but then you live a life unsupported by any deeds or internal allegiance shifts. You say the right thing, but if you look at the trajectory of your heart or even your actions, there's not a whole lot of life change. This is also really damaging. This leads to fruitfulness. This is just lip service. Is there any places in my life where I'm rendering Jesus lip service? I'm saying the right things. I was convicted of that even as Linda was leading us through that prayer for the offering. It's like those are some strong words if you actually look at them. There's some strong words. I don't want to just say words. I want to embody them. There's this in the parable. There's another one where Jesus says the seed grows on the soil and it grows up fast. But then what happens is the weeds and the concerns of life choke it out. And I think there's another way that we can be fruitless, and that's speed and pace. We can live such lives of such frenetic speed that the demands and worries of this present life kill fruitfulness. And in a place like a Bay Area, this is really, really challenging. This is a really challenging thing. A couple of months ago, I had this really interesting experience with a bunch of high schoolers My daughter was poised to go on a service trip to Peru. I don't know how up to date you are on Peruvian governmental affairs. Probably pretty up to date. But what happened is in April, there was this crazy protest that happened. There was a famous Peruvian singer star, and these thieves, these bandits, kind of got on his tour bus and held him hostage for ransom, and then killed everybody. And the whole area, the whole capital city of Lima, protested, and they came out and they declared martial law. And the U.S. State Department's like, no travel to Peru, especially to Lima. And we're flying into Lima in 3 days, and we're like, oh man! So we had to cancel the trip. And all the seniors had just raised money, and it was super sad. And they were like, well, what are we going to do? And the school's like, I don't know, maybe we can clean the books in the library. And they were like, no, that's terrible. And so I was like, well, maybe I can help. So I was like, hey, I could take them to Mexico. We have an orphanage there, and they're always looking for help. I could take all the students to Mexico. And the school was like, you cannot take 25 seniors across international borders on 2 days' notice. I'm like, I'll bring them back. And they were like, no, that's too much. And so they go, you can go domestically. I'm like, where am I supposed to go to create a service trip that's a cross-cultural mission trip inside the continental, or inside the U.S. borders? And I was like, oh, Hawaii. So some of you know I lived in Hawaii for a while. And I was like, we can go to Hawaii, and we can serve the victims of the Lahaina fire. We can work at food banks. We can do all sorts of work at the YMCA. So that's what we did. We went over there, and we spent the whole week kind of serving there. It was amazing. And one of the things that every student said, they said to me, they said, Dave, something about the pace of life here in Hawaii makes it so much easier to be a Christian. They slow down. There's something about their pace of life that's conducive to Jesus. They wake up in the morning to watch the sun. They watch the sunset. They pause. They're involved. There was this spirit of it. And there were so many Christians that we met, and they're Hawaiian Christians, and they had a speed that was like 4 shifts down. And they prioritized, and there was a speed. And they're like, it's just easier to be a Christian here. And I thought that was super profound for students. Speed and pace can kill fruitfulness. That's real. And then, of course, there's another, and this is a rare category, but you might see it. In fact, the hard part about this final category is the people who need to hear it aren't in this room. And what happens is life gets hard, and you used to be committed, and you used to walk with Jesus, but then life got difficult, and you just kind of drifted away. You just fell away. And the problem with that one is those people aren't in this room. This happens a ton to people. Life gets really difficult, and I just watch them drift away. The image I have is like we're in like the space station, and they were tethered in, and then they untethered, and they just drifted off into space. And I'm like, man, I got to go search outer space to try to find them and have them come back home, And this is another reality. Sometimes life gets really difficult, and people turn cynical and bitter, and they're mad at God, and they've got no way to process it. And that's another thing that can destroy fruitfulness. And one of the commentaries on John 15, one of the writers had this line, and I just read it, and I'm going to share it with you. It's really tough to read. It said, it is a first principle of the New Testament that uselessness invites disaster. The fruitless branch is on the way to destruction. And I just read that, and I was like, God, I don't want to be fruitless. I don't want to have any branches of any part of my life that are fruitless. Would you help me see? So I just wanted to pause just with a moment of pastoral reflection. And this is just super between you and God, because I have no idea any aspect of your life, but the Lord does. So let me just go through these again. And just in a time of quiet reflection, just let the Spirit talk to you. Are there areas of your life where you're refusing to listen to Jesus? You're stonewalling him and saying no. Are there areas of your life where you're giving lip service to Jesus, but it's unsupported by deeds or life change? Is the pace of your life so fast that it crowds God out? Are there areas where you're pulling away from God because life has become difficult? It's been hard, and you just feel yourself pulling away from God? Let's all do the work with the Spirit's help to get rid of these areas of fruitlessness. Because we're made for fruit. Which leads us to our next question, which is a tough one. What exactly is fruitfulness? What does Jesus want from me? What does he want from us? Well, to answer this, we kind of got to look at vines in general. What's interesting is in the Jewish tradition, the grapevine represented freedom and liberation for the Hebrew people. In Jewish thought, the vine symbolized, and all through the Old Testament, the vine always symbolizes Israel. It symbolizes that God chose them, that God nurtured them, that he planted them to bear the fruit of righteousness and looking like him, and that they were dependent on his care, and they were accountable to God for producing joy and blessing that God had intended to all the nations. So, for example, in Psalm 80, the psalmist writes, "You transplanted a vine from Egypt. You drove out the nations and planted it." What is this referring to? This is referring to when Yahweh rescues the Hebrew people from slavery in Egypt, and then he transplants them and makes them a vine, right? And then in Isaiah 27, God says this through the prophet Isaiah. God says, "Sing about a fruitful vineyard. I, the Lord, watch over it. I water it continually. I guard it day and night so that no one may harm it. In the days to come, Jacob will take root. Israel will bud and blossom and fill all the world with fruit." This is the promise of what God will do through the vine of Israel. So all through the Old Testament, the primary metaphor for Israel is a vine. But how good of a vine was? So for those of you who know the story, was Israel a really fruitful and flourishing vine that was faithful to God through all the days? No, the answer is no. They were very bad. They were very not good. They were not good at all. So in an incredible plot twist in the New Testament, right here in John 15, what does Jesus do? He doesn't say, Israel's the vine. What does he say? I'm the vine, and you're connected to me, right? I'm tired of this. I'm tired of you guys I'm the vine now. I am the captain now. You're the vine. Get in here. Be connected to me, and it'll all be good. Jesus takes this example. This is a giant messianic twist. This is a giant messianic plot twist, right? Jesus says, I'm the true vine. But it goes even further than that. Jesus says, I'm not just the vine, I'm actually going to produce a fruit. And this fruit, this wine that comes from me, if you drink it, it'll bring you freedom from sin and the powers of death and the powers of destruction and the powers of sin and death. And so in Luke 22, we see after supper, he took another cup of wine and said, this wine is the new covenant between God and his people, an agreement confirmed with my blood, which is poured out as a sacrifice for you. Jesus says the communion wine, which is the fruit of the vine, of which he is the true vine, is actually the thing that leads to freedom and to life. Jesus says that this wine from him, from the true vine, is what beats death and power and allows God's life in us. And how does that come to be? Through Jesus' death. That's why we take communion. This is why we do this. So the substance of the fruit that Jesus wants to bear in us is this. This is the substance of the fruit that Jesus wants to bear in us. It's the fruit of sacrifice, which leads to joy. It's the fruit of dying to ourselves for the sake of others. This is Jesus' most prescient and powerful example to us. It's not just an example, he actually did it. This is Jesus dying for us. This is the fruit that he's talking about. This is the fruit that we're to bear. Remember, we have a couple different definitions for spiritual formation. We have two of them. I'm going to share them again. We've shared them every week just as a way to remind ourselves. The first one's from Robert Mulholland, and these are in various degrees of helpfulness. So maybe this one will be helpful, maybe the next one will be. It says this: spiritual formation is a process of being formed in the image of Christ for the sake of others. Our lives are not meant for just ourselves. They're meant for others. One of the things that this can do is maybe spur you on to remember that the spiritual formation is about fruit for other people. But this is actually kind of incomplete. This is kind of an incomplete definition. So we have a more complete, longer definition, which might also help. It might help you as well. Jeffrey Greenman has this as a definition. He said, spiritual formation is our continuing response to the reality of God's grace shaping us into the image of Jesus Christ through the work of the Holy Spirit in the community of faith for God's glory, for our good, and for the sake of others. So it's all three. I'm reminded as at the end of the New Testament, in the end of Matthew, Jesus says this to his disciples, "Go and make disciples of all nations, baptizing them in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit, and teaching them to obey everything I have commanded you. And surely I am with you always to the very end of the age." This is called the Great Commission. And basically what it is, hey, go out there and die to yourself, sacrifice your own lives so that others might live. Use your life's energy to share and to tell this news and to bring people into the community of faith, the family of faith. This is what fruit God is looking for. So anytime you do this, anytime you sacrifice, anytime you give of yourself in any context for someone else that they might live, you have the fruit of Jesus. So some pastoral reflections. Who in your relational circle needs you right now? Some questions for you to work through. What would it look like for you to serve them well? Is there anyone in your circle that's on a crisis or on a quest? If they are, this is an awesome opportunity for you to serve them. Next one. Let me put it up here on the screen too so you can read it. Live an open, hospitable, and invitational life. Just live a life in which you're trying to connect with other people. Is there somebody that you can connect with? And then also be ready and willing to give an answer for the hope that you have. Which means share about what God's done in your own life. And for those who, especially who are on a crisis or on a quest, they're real keen. And you can be a trusted guide to those folks. Parents, every time you pour into your children, sacrificially, this is the fruit of sacrifice. This is the fruit of dying to ourselves. Every time you care about a coworker, not for advancement, but just because they matter to you, that's the fruit of sacrifice. That's dying to yourself. Anytime you care for your neighbor, as you would care for yourself, whoever that neighbor is, whoever that coworker is, whoever that family member is, anytime you help anybody, and it costs you, for the sake of God's glory, we're dying to ourselves. What's that look like? I'm going to close with a final reflection and a story. And I want to introduce you to a very famous photographer that I was not aware of, but he is a world-famous photographer named Sebastião Salgado. He's Brazilian. He actually passed away in May of 2025. He was an acclaimed photojournalist. He spent decades documenting some of the most important moments in human history during his lifetime, including the fact that he was in Rwanda when the conflict broke out, and he documented the war and the genocide there. One of the worst moments in recent modern history. And this is a famous photograph that he posted just of the devastation afterwards and the aftermath of that genocide. But as you can imagine, after spending that much time staring that closely at that kind of broken evil, it took a toll. And so he returned back home to his childhood home in Brazil, in the region of Minas Gerais, a broken man. He had this to say when he was interviewed. He said this, he said, "I've been infected by violence. I have been infected by violence." It was like a sickness that had got all the way to his bones. He had seen some of the worst atrocities in human history. And he's sick. And he also said this, he's like, I've lost my hope, my belief in humanity. And so he was returning home to his childhood home in Brazil, roots, home, right? And he was hoping for this. And it was a lush area, a lush forest that he grew up in. It's a tropical region. He grew up in Brazil, in the Amazonian rainforest, right? In the Atlantic rainforest. And because of a variety of reasons, deforestation had just happened. There was a move during the 90s, if you recall. Let's just cut down all the trees. Everyone thought that was a good idea. And then they cut down so much of the Brazilian rainforest and the Amazonian rainforest and the Atlantic rainforest that it turned it barren. And so this is what his home looked like when he returned home. It was just barren and desert, and it used to be a rainforest. And something deep happened inside of Sebastião Salgado's soul. It's like this landscape matched what was going on in his heart. He felt dry. He felt fruitless. He felt barren. And his soul began to ache, and despair began to creep in. Maybe some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. But Salgado did not give in to despair because he had a wife who was a good woman, and she encouraged him. And she said, let's begin to replant the rainforests. Let's begin to replant home. And so they did. Little trees. He began planting small trees that were native to this land that had been taken. Day after day, plant trees. Now, there's plenty of weather. It was tropical. It was lush. They would grow. All they needed to do was be planted. And he began to plant. He began to plant. And he began to plant. And every day and every week, he began to plant more and more and more and more. He said this in an interview. He said, I thought I was dying, but my wife had the idea to replant the forest. And when we began to plant trees, to see life return, my life began to return too. It is in fruitfulness that he found fruit. It is in fruitfulness he found life. He began to plant, and others joined him. And he actually became a religious person, a Christ follower. And he began to invite others to something called the Genesis Project, which was to plant trees. And over the next 2 decades, they planted over 2 million trees. It's estimated that he replanted 16% of the Amazon rainforest by himself and his organization. And I want to show you the before and after. This is Minas Gerais when he returned, and this is Minas Gerais today. And isn't this what you want from your life? Isn't this what you want most? To look at your life and see fruit and life and lushness because of your efforts. Partnering with God to bring life where only God can bring life. This is what we want. We want fruit. And God says, apart from me, you can do nothing. But with me, this is possible. We can have lush lives filled with life. So let us be diligent in cutting out all the areas of life that are fruitless. Just submit them all to God and say, I remain in you that you might bear much fruit. But I want to talk to another group as we end here. I have one more thing to say. One more invitation. This is to a small number of people in the room. But we like to do this occasionally because I think it's really important. I want to talk to 2 groups in this room in particular. There are those in this room who have never actually turned your life over to Jesus. That's never been a thing you've done. You've never actually said, or you've treated Jesus like maybe something to add to your life. But Jesus doesn't want to be added to your life. He wants to be the center. And you maybe feel God's Spirit right now saying, come to me. And that can happen this morning. You can do that right now. You can do that right now. In just a second, we're going to give you an opportunity to say and to respond to God's urging and God's invitation to you to come home. And there's another category equally important, and those are those of you who maybe used to be connected and you felt this, but man, in the past days or weeks or months or years, you felt like you've drifted away from God, and it's time to come home. You feel God saying, it's time to come home. It's time to come home. This is where life is. And you feel God's Spirit really drawing you to that. And you hear Jesus saying to you very clearly through His Spirit, come home, child, come home. You and me. This is how it's meant to be. You and me together. And that can happen this morning, right here, right now in this room. So I'm going to ask us to bow bow our heads and just close your eyes, if everyone can do that. In the quietness of this place, if that was you, and you feel really strongly that God is inviting you to come back home, and you felt far away, and it's time for you to come home, you do me a favor, just in the quietness of this room, will you just raise your hand and look at me, and I will look back at you, and I will say, I see you and God sees you. If that's you, if you feel God's Spirit calling you to return home, just raise your hand and look at me. I see you, and God sees you too. I see you, and God sees you too. I see you, and God sees you too. And if this was something you've never done before, if you've never really turned your life over to God, and man, you feel right now in your spirit, God is saying, come to me. If that's you, will you raise your hand and just look at me? I see you, and God sees you too. Amen. Guys, some folks came home today. Can we give it up for God? Remain in me, Jesus says, you will bear so much fruit. Let us work to remain in him. Let us work to remain in him. Will you stand with me as we pray, praise and worship God?